Hi everyone, welcome to episode 98 of the ITSM crowd. We are closing in on the big 100. We're continuing our theme today of the evolution of service management and taking a slightly different look at it today by bringing in a guest from way back in my career who has a lot of service management experience, but then has gone off in quite a different direction. So what I'm going to do is start by just asking Keith to introduce yourself. Keith, tell us a little bit about your background, where we met and how things have evolved since then.
Well, first of all, hello everybody, and Claire, thank you. We have only got half an hour, so you want me to go through the whole thing, haven't you? I started my IT career off the back of being a qualified horticulturalist back in the late 90s. So an unusual way to go as I stepped into management. And I think that whole evolved as I went through the usual process of being Microsoft certified engineer, CCNA, all the usual things. And then eventually went into management in that space, which is probably around 2007-ish, 8-ish, around there, which was when I started to learn about ITIL. Met you. So for those watching, Claire was my instructor. So anybody that's watching that knows me, it's her fault. No, absolutely brilliant. I think that was where the friendship grew because she was such a good instructor. But I saw so many synergies as I'd gone through all the different places in management, ended up in IT, and how that crossed over from box standard service management. You know, the stakeholder piece, how you manage problems, resolve problems, brought all the different parts in, how you communicated across different platforms. So I saw the real relevance back then of how service management had so much more scope. And I think some of the things I learned as I went through from problem management, rolling out new services, I saw how you could use those in different areas. Now, as Claire said, obviously I went in a totally different direction. So while I was doing all of that, I was a reservist. I went out to Iraq and served. And then, where are we now? It's about 13, 14 years ago, I moved over into the full-time space of the army and worked my way through there. But what was interesting was, as I went into different projects, whether I was working in Brussels as part of the European Military Service, there are opportunities to improve process, solve problems, manage stakeholders. And again, I start to see the similarity of service management, which obviously now has evolved, which we're going to be talking about today, SIAM. And I saw all those great things. And as I've moved into the role that I'm currently doing, which is, although it's working with young people and inspiring them, it's very much the systems around that I'm still using those transferable skills. And I'm back slightly in the IT because I look after the system that the Army uses to manage all of those interactions and events. So I'm back working with developers and in that space. So I've got a foot back in that camp. But again, just managing that system has brought it all back to life again in the service management. So I've tried to sum up the last 20 years as quick as I can there for you, Claire.
Yeah, I think the main message there is you can never truly escape IT, can you? It'll always find you again. But yeah, and just kind of a reminder to people, because I can see we've got some people watching live throughout this. If you've got questions, pop them into the YouTube comments. We can bring them up on screen and ask them. So if there's anything you want to ask Keith as we go through this, then by all means, please do. But we're just going to chat about that experience because we caught up recently for the first time in a long time. And one of the things that there just seemed to be such a huge overlap for me, because I'm very much in the SIAM space at the moment, and you were talking about these complex projects that you run in, all the different stakeholders, and just tell us a little bit more about that and the kind of the challenges that you're dealing with.
I think I'll use an example previously, which is, like I said, I worked in the European Military Service. So I was working in the UK and out in Europe when we were still part of Europe. And we used to deliver what was called a European battle group, which meant that different nations came together. So the one that I was looking after was 5 nations, including the UK. But we had a European process. And I discovered that the process didn't quite fit and wasn't quite right. So you would expect, and everybody said, you can't do this, Europe, it'll take a long time. And it's that crossover of stakeholder management, because the classic is everybody presents everything out and says, there you go, everybody works away, does their own work and brings it back. And they work in their silos. And by working in the silos, you're constantly at loggerheads. So whereas my approach is very much service management, I know everybody does everything differently. So in this case, 5 different nations, how they brought their soldiers together to train, how they brought them together to deploy them, whether we flew them, everything else was all done slightly differently, including down to ammunition. So you can see, not only have we got the stakeholders in the different nations, but you've got all the different aspects of that. If you put that into an IT perspective, you've got your developer, you've got the web developer side of it, you've got the server team, all those different aspects, all delivering something different, but all need to coordinate together. So rather than allow everybody to work in the silos, we brought them together and then worked through all the different scenarios, understanding how the different stakeholders approach their problems, how they resolve them, where the similarities was, how we had to adjust where we got the connection together, where they came together and the 2 different layers could connect correctly, what we had to do and how we had to understand. We were able in 3 months to change and rewrite a policy that worked in Europe, that was adopted. Wow. So it wasn't in a political space, this wasn't a military space, but even there it can take a long time. But for me, it was that understanding of the differences that everybody brings. So I suppose from a SIAM point of view, if you were to look at it in that vein, you've got different deliverables and people want to have their process to get their products to you, but at some point they have to connect together, and it's how do you make that work? And to me, it was open, honest, it was being upfront and sitting around a table. In our case, we did actually bring everybody around a table and work it through and be honest with each other as you're working it through, because the other thing I found in my experience is 9 times out of 10, someone isn't honest around the table, you get a great plan, you walk out the door, and in classic army style, it doesn't survive first contact. So I suppose that's one of the first ones. And now what I'm doing with this current system, so web-based system, it collects data from around the country. It has to be exceptionally simple because we've got lots of different soldiers across the country feeding into this, but we don't have the ability to run a major training system. There isn't a call center. In essence, I'm with one other, is it? And I have a day job. This is only the sign on. So we don't have a call center you can call. We don't have a problem management system for it because there isn't a full infrastructure from ITIL in my old days and probably going forward how it would sit. But I've been trying to build that into the ITIL process. So it's obviously in system. We've treated a revamp that we did a year ago. There's a new evolving system. So lots of communication, user feedback. Whenever there's a release, we get the feedback immediately. And we tried to solve problems as quick as we could. But we also tried to build it bottom up. And this comes back into the stakeholder piece. So if you think about the country for us is divided into 10. And that's one aspect of the delivery, which is what we would call engagement. But also all of the army recruiting feeds into the system, which is a totally different stakeholder to the engagement side of it. So 2 sides of the system, 2 different stakeholders. And then every region, the 10 regions in the engagement side, that's 10 different stakeholders. And then in the recruiting side, there's just a plethora from our outsourced material and everybody else. So it's trying to constantly pull all the different stakeholders who are looking for different outputs from the system, while at the same time managing one of the biggest stakeholders, in my view, is the end user. That has to capture this information, because if it's long, laborious, and they really don't understand it and it isn't intuitive, then you end up with rubbish going in because they start to put what they think needs to go in rather than what needs to go in. So it's that balance of all those different stakeholders. And again, lots of feedback, being honest with stakeholders. That sounds marvelous, but And it's not going to happen. It doesn't work. You know, how do you get that? And that challenge that you have to do with stakeholders. Because that's the other thing we often run when we're trying to do stakeholder management. We often pander to the stakeholder, and that sounds quite condescending, but we're worried that the stakeholder may remove their stake because
Yes.
we haven't given them what they want. Well, sometimes giving them what they want is not necessarily what they need. And it's having that honest conversation and working out what you need. So, for example, can you tell me how many young people we engaged with that wore Nike trainers? Is that relevant?
Yes.
Is it what I want today? Well, how are you going to use that in a management information space? What decision will you make from that? What interested? Well, in that case, we don't need it. And the reality is anybody going to really, truly collect that? Is it worth the investment of someone collecting it? And it's bringing stakeholders, someone back round as, well, you may want this, you may feel you need it, but what's the return on investment to get to that space?
Yeah.
So those are the sort of things as well that constantly, and being on the stakeholder in reverse, where I've been in the receiving end traditionally years ago, I suddenly got bored of people saying, yes, we can do that. I go, but that's great, but how and why? And
should we do that?
And then all of a sudden there's either be a cost with it or an additional time with it. And it was that I want the honesty and the feedback back. So, and you'll notice the theme here, honesty, in my view, is one of the biggest things in that stakeholder management. But backed up with facts, realism, because that's really what makes it key.
And that all sounds incredibly agile, which is not necessarily something I think that a lot of people would associate with military IT projects. Is that a recent transformation, or is this how you've been working all along and we've just been making assumptions?
Well, I don't sit in the main IT delivery piece for the Army, so this is very much for us driven from my personal experience, because like I said, he's not round. So the Army has a lot of other systems around it. Interestingly, what I have noticed, because we do sit within the Army space, is very much that the Army is moving into that. They've got some really high caliber people, and in the area that I sit in, not necessarily, there's lots of different areas within the Army systems, but the area that I'm working in for this, because it's accessible from outside of a military system, you can get to it from Googling your home PC, as we have a lot of our training things in that space now. A lot of our reservists are able to access through that, and it's called Defence Connect. That side of it is becoming very agile. We've literally just moved to the cloud base now, so it's gone cloud. The contractors, as well as the military side that we're working with, are definitely working into that space, a lot more agile, forward thinking. So hard to comment from a general pan Army, but in the space I'm in, it's definitely going into that arena.
It sounds good. And I think I want to come back as well, because we've covered a huge amount just then. And I almost want to come back to the thing that you were saying earlier on about the European group, because this was the thing to me that just mapped onto SIAM so clearly, because in a SIAM model, we're always talking about allowing the service providers to work in the way that is best suited to them. And we have this conversation about, can you put DevOps into a SIAM model? And yes, of course you can. But a lot of the problems that we hit in the SIAM world tend to be cultural. So you're bringing lots of organizations together. Quite often they compete out in the wider market. So you've got to encourage them to work together. And you had those cultural issues, but kind of on a much bigger scale as well, because you are dealing with different countries, different geographies. So what kind of techniques were you using to build those relationships and encourage everybody to play nicely together?
I think the reality is, for us, you're always driven in that space. We're always driven by the concept that we would need to deploy real people as soldiers somewhere in the world. So there was always that possibility there. So you tend to be driven by the fact that the process must be correct to employ them into the right place at the right time, the right equipment, safely and expediently as you could do. So you tend to have a commonality with that desire to achieve that. So you have a base to build from. So from a civilian point of view, whenever I used to do a similar sort of thing, it would be trying to find the common ground.
Yep.
Which, of course, when it comes to stakeholders, where they've probably just been competing, now they have to be working together, that becomes different. But the one thing that will always be, even with competing factors, is that they want to do the best job that makes the most money, but correctly so they get further business. So there's always going to be some commonality there. So just because this one may cost, I always tended to look for where they could build a reputation of working together.
Yeah.
To be able to sell each other going further down the line. And I'll take you right back now to when I was talking about, from the horticulture days, when I was working in, before partnership working became a buzzword, I was saving a failing service in a local authority. The only way I could do it was to build partnerships with local suppliers. So that I could offer something different, because as everybody knows, 9 times out of 10, the overheads on a local authority in a competitive world cripple them and makes it exceptionally difficult. So I worked in partnership with a lot of suppliers, because it was hard landscaping, and things like fencing and equipment in playgrounds or benches that would give a guarantee of workmanship that we could offer alongside us. They were then able to, or if it was fencing, they would do the ground survey for us. So it's cheaper for us. But they, one, got more work. Two, we were able to say we worked in partnership and they worked in partnership. So again, it's that common ground. It was a benefit for them. And with an IT system, when I introduced an asset management system into Nottingham City Council, 3-year project, I needed to do in a year. How do you do that? First of all, I had to make businesses compete against each other. So I got the best price and the best time. But then off the back of it, I had to work out how, because some of those businesses also delivered the infrastructure. So they may have lost the business with me for the actual asset management system, but also I needed the infrastructure off them afterwards. So it's how you then, so I'm sorry you haven't got that contract, but there's an opportunity here, because we know that you're good in the infrastructure space, for you to be able to come on board. And if you then, we're happy to showcase you in that space, supporting us, so that any prospective client, because obviously you had a local authority, we would then showcase. We're quite happy to host for 2 hours, saying this is brilliant, this is how it worked. They would get their business off the back, because that's how I could actually bring a stakeholder on board that I'm literally just annoyed because they'd lost the business. And then at the same time, their competitor that was delivering the software, the same situation, but then demonstrating how they work together. So we would sell both of them at the same time in the same space. There was the commonality of the base to build from, very much as in Europe, where the thing that drove us to get the best process was the soldier that we had to deploy somewhere.
It does. And just a reminder to the people watching us live, if you want to ask Keith questions, pop them in the chat. We will pick them up in this last 12 minutes that we've got. But
already,
the thing that's jumped out at me there, and I had this to a certain extent when I was working in the health service as well, is you had a really, really clear vision for what you were trying to do. And that is incredibly helpful for dragging everybody along. And something that I see time and time again, and we saw it back in the days when we were working together, that organizations were doing ITIL to become ITIL organizations. And we see this a little bit in the SIAM world as well, that these ways of working are being adopted just for the sake of it. And it's working really hard to understand what is the outcome that you are trying to achieve. And I think, you had it was black and white there, wasn't it? Easy to measure whether you'd succeeded or failed, human consequences if there is a failure. And that helps everybody, I presume, to to come along.
Focuses the mind.
Yes,
But
definitely.
wherever you go, I think but it comes back to me, it is that it's really clear, and it's the same as with any change management, whatever that is. You implement any system, the people will have moaned about that system and said it's rubbish. Up until the moment they switched to the new system. You've been there the same as I have. You switched to the new system. The old system was amazing. Well, it wasn't 2 days ago. It was absolutely appalling. And it's because it's the change, and all of a sudden I've got something new to learn. Although it was clunky, they knew what was clunky, and the new one's got different clunky bits. So it is that change management, and I think it is that vision and taking people with you that's really key. And I think, and we've seen that when we did some of that work together in that local authority, there was so much being done to say, well, we've got problem management, we've got change management,
Yeah.
Like, well, yeah, but you haven't. No, you've got all the paperwork out, the textbooks, you've got all of this, and nobody really felt they bought into it. Most people felt they were doing it so that we could say we were ITIL aligned, or we were an ITIL organisation, or whatever the catchphrase was at the time. And I think that's the key piece for me, whether you're doing SIAM, whether you're implementing ITIL, whatever it is that getting the staff to understand why you're doing it. Because when you understand why, you then start to understand what you've got to do. And when you've got to do it by. And I think that's the most important thing for me. So it has to be a strategy. It's got to have an end state or a vision that at least you can fit into if it's not a clearly defined line. And that's got to remain constant. Doesn't matter if the journey to the end state changes.
Yes.
Because it should. Because you may have to turn left when you thought you were going to turn right, but that's good management, that's good leadership, that's recognizing situations change, but you're still on the way to the same destination. And if the staff are not in that space because they're confused, because they keep thinking they're going to a different destination, that's when it starts to unpick and unfold.
Yeah, and again, that's absolutely agile thinking, isn't it? We know roughly where we're trying to get to. We don't necessarily know what the journey looks like because we're keeping trying things along the way. It's it's very aligned. So what else from the service management world has been helpful to you in the military space?
There's a good question. I wasn't thinking about one of those.
Dealing with paperwork.
I suppose, I think the process, because for me it was the life cycle really. And what I've taken, I used to look at everything quite linear. And I think whereas when we got into version 4 from ITIL and we introduced the life cycle, so much more made sense, not only from an IT perspective, but everything that I was doing in a management space and in the military space. It is, we will talk about mission command. We talk about the OODA loop cycle, which is, observe, orientate, decision, action. And the idea is that your process of that is a circle. You're quicker thinking than your adversary, whatever that is, whether that be on the sports field, on the battlefield, wherever. And that started to resonate with me because that really ties into how you should be doing service management as well, because the two go together. For a life cycle, it evolves, you come up with the concept, you work it through, you trial it, it goes into reality, you evaluate as it goes through, and then maybe you retire it. So if we take my current role now, where we work with young people, we inspire young people to recognise their potential. So we're not recruiters, the whole thing is we connect with society from an army perspective, but along the way we're inspiring young people to basically recognise that they've got a dream, what that dream is, and try to path towards it, as we were talking about a minute ago. But in that we use lots of different techniques. So for me, we're constantly evolving and changing. So we get new pieces of equipment come in that we perhaps looked at from an innovation point of view. So we've started that process. We've decided we want something new, may not be a system. We've got to trial it. we make sure it works, we get feedback, we adjust the way we're going to use it, we take it into production and then through into the live environment. In the live environment, we constantly review, adjust, update if things don't work, it's not quite right, we fix it. And then eventually we get to a point where we're not seeing the benefit within young people, we're not having the impact, so we go on to retiring it at the same time as looking at what replaces it. So to me, that's probably where I would say, from a service management perspective, I've taken ITIL, mainly version 4 in the life cycle, and use it now in a current environment. I'm sorry, I bounced on the table there, I'm bouncing away.
Bit of enthusiasm. And I think just one last question, which is with my trainer head on, because one of the things that we talk about a lot is digital skills and the importance of digital skills, the digital skills gap. And we were kind of chatting about this in the green room, and you said, what is digital skills? And I was like, oh, it's a weird catch-all phrase, but how important are digital skills for people coming into the army now? Is it something that's grown quite rapidly? And do you see a digital skills gap from your role as well?
So from a digital skills point of view, everybody now works with some form of IT. You've got to write reports, you've got to be able to use. So as we had that discussion, it goes from one extreme to the other, because it could be just being able to use Microsoft Office all the way through to programming. Where do you sit? So from an army perspective, as soon as you start to move up the ranks, you're writing reports and everything else. So those digital skills are really key, and the army teach them. Anybody that joins the army starts at that post. We take them to their basic English and maths if they don't have it, and then they are constantly learning. So if they can't do something, they can go on a course and learn how to do it. And we teach them everything from engineering all the way through, depending on what trade they're in. So yes, basic skills are really key. Do I see across the board? It's fascinating working in the space I am at the minute. A lot of people I heard when we went through COVID said, really, there's not that many people. One phone in a house, seriously? Yes, we see it. Some of the areas, which one of them was the estate next door to where I grew up. I came from a council estate. And we went back there 30 odd years, I showed my age now, 30 odd years after I'd left. And I was amazed, these young people weren't even leaving that estate to go into the estate next door. And when we were talking to the youth workers, some of those children didn't even have, it's like one old style Nokia, about 3 kids. We were absolutely amazed, bearing in mind most of the things we were reading is that, all kids are now digitally savvy, all have got a phone. And actually, I'd say the reverse. I've seen a downtrend in certain areas of the community. So, yes, I think it's massively important. My concern is how much access young people in certain areas of the community get to that digital opportunity to be able to build those skills.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very valid point. So we are almost at time. So I'm going to ask you to finish, as we always do, with some top tips. I think we've pulled a lot of these out already. Understand the strategy, course correctors needed, but work towards it. Honesty. But is there anything you'd like to leave people with in the last couple of minutes, or even any resources that you want to point people to?
I think, rather than resources, I think the biggest thing for me, and you're right, one of my top tips is always going to be honesty, and inclusion and brevity. Probably my top 3. So honesty, we've spoken about that. We bounce round, we massage egos. Well, actually, honesty with facts tends, although can be painful, tends to get the better and quicker result in the long term. Brevity, we have with our digital capability now. Why use one page when 50 will do? It's we spend hours wading through because everybody adds something. A really good one pager with a good bottom line up front that captures someone's imagination is 10 times more powerful than trying to give them all the information, because you've created far more questions, but you're not steering their questions anymore. So, and that's the same in a conversation. So brevity in that place. I forgot what my last one was now. Now I'm telling through there.
Honesty, brevity. Something else.
Exactly, as I was going through.
Well, we are going to have to wrap it up
And we're
there
out of time
anyway.
anyway,
We are out of time, but our next episode is 14th of April, 10 a.m. BST, because the clocks will have changed in the UK then. And I'm going to be joined by Neris Mutler from ServiceNow, and we're going to be talking about platform and the evolution of platform and how that's linked to service management as well. So Keith, massive thanks. Really, really appreciate it. Some brilliant advice there, and fascinating to hear your journey as well. So thank you so much to that.
No problem.
Thank you to the
Inclusion,
people
by
who've
the
been
way.
watching.
It's the last one.
Inclusion.
Remember it at the end.
Thank you everybody who's been watching, and thank you again, Keith, and we will see you all on the next episode of the ITSM Crowd. Thank you.